Welcome to Annapolis Mosaics. Our program spotlights people in our community who are involved in activities designed to promote good human relations. I am Michael Keller, the chair of the Annapolis Human Relations Commission and your host. The commission is a city board which seeks to promote equal opportunity and to eliminate discrimination. My guests today are Elizabeth Bannock, who's Executive Director of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, and Jen Poliakonis, President of the organization. Jen and Elizabeth, welcome to Annapolis Mosaics.
Thank you so much.
Well, what do you seek to accomplish as an organization?
Wow, that's a pretty lofty question. So we are a Maryland-based organization, and as a Maryland-based organization, we feel like we need to speak to the needs here. And we feel that often the two issues in gun violence most overlooked are the issues of violence within urban areas such as Baltimore and Prince George's County, and the issue of suicide. So we have made those our two pressing points, but we have a large agenda, and we work both on a legislative side and an educational side. And Jen does a lot of our our legislative work, so I can turn it over to her with.
Well, we'll talk about all of that as part of the interview. But first, I'd like to ask you this broad question: is why do you think what you do is important? What's important about your work?
Well, I didn't think it was as important even 5 years ago. I wasn't involved in any nonprofits. I wasn't involved politically speaking, except to have debates with my friends and family. And then mass shootings kept happening, and I kept thinking that surely our laws are going to be strong enough, and these problems will cease. And the shootings kept getting worse. And then Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting happened almost 4 years ago in December 14th of 2012. And I had two little boys home at the time. I'd been a teacher, and I had two children, so I saw it both from the viewpoint as an educator and from the viewpoint as a parent with my kids. And I sat around and I cried, and I realized that by never focusing on this issue, by never being the one to stand up and say we need to do something about this, I was complacent and I was complicit in all of the shootings, in the deaths of those children, in the deaths of those educators, and I realized that it's our civic duty to get involved in these issues. And so I stood up and I said, okay, that's what we're going to do. And so we joined first a national organization to prevent gun violence, and then the more we learned about the issue, the more we realized that people are dying in our own backyard in Baltimore, and we need to find solutions that will work to reduce those deaths too. And so we started, more of a local and state-based mission.
Well, let's talk about some of the specific activities in which your organization's involved with, and I've taken this information based on the research which I've done on it from your website. One of the things that I think that you're really engaged in is protecting Maryland's 2013 Firearms Safety Act. Can you share a little bit about what that law actually does and why you would identify it as something that needs to be protected?
So we worked really hard along with Vinnie DeMarco, who is the gentleman who established Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence back in early January of 2013, on this really package of bills. It has an assault weapons ban, a limitation on magazine capacity, and while the majority of gun homicides and gun violence is done with handguns, assault weapons and large magazines allow people intent on doing harm to do it very, very quickly and be very efficient about it. But the foundation of this law is really handgun purchaser licensing. And this, combined with background checks, has been shown in studies by the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research to reduce homicides and also gun suicides. And so this is a policy that does not affect the Second Amendment. We are not an anti-gun group. We are looking for solutions that are going to reduce gun violence and to help public safety. And that's what this does. So you can still get a handgun. It's just beforehand you have to pass a background check, and you have to take a safety course, and you have to be fingerprinted. And this is going to save lives. And this is something that we are going to work to also get in other states so that our streets are safer, because it'll prevent other guns from coming into our states.
And we really do think of ourselves as, I mean, Maryland is a leader in gun violence prevention, and we would like to be a model for other states. I mean, that's one of the things we would like our state to be, is to show ways that you can do this effectively.
I know you've mentioned that you're involved in doing research on this subject. What has your research found? What kinds of studies have you done, if any, that promote the work that you're doing?
So we personally haven't done our own research.
Okay.
We promote
Okay.
research in general,
right.
because we view this issue as a public health and safety issue.
Right.
And we want to find evidence-based policies. So we work very closely with the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. Center for American Progress does wonderful research on this issue. And we think it's so important to share the results of these resources so that we can educate people on this issue and raise awareness for not only the lives that are lost, but also for solutions that we know will prevent these deaths from happening. We just need to enact them.
You also do a lot of work in terms of work into the community, in terms of expanding people's awareness and understanding and education and the like. How do you go about doing that? What kinds of things do you do in that respect, in that regard?
We have some amazing organizations with whom we work. And I think, as Jen was saying, that the research aspect that we bring to educate ourselves and others when we go to Annapolis to lobby, we also go into the community and we actually ask these communities that are disproportionately affected by gun violence to become part of this communication. Because I think for a very long time, individuals who have been disproportionately affected by that, and largely we're talking about African American communities in Baltimore, they haven't been at the table when these conversations are being had. One of the organizations we work most closely with is Moms of Murdered Sons and Daughters. It's a mostly Baltimore-based, but they spread beyond Baltimore, but it's a group of women whose children have been killed by guns. And they have helped us both understand on the ground what's happening, so it's partly educating us, but it's also, we can then take that information and bring it to our members, and I think it's been a hugely important and critically missing part of this conversation to bring those voices in.
You had mentioned earlier that you're interested in the whole issue of criminal background checks and expanding criminal background checks. Where does the law currently stand in Maryland on that? Where does it stand nationally on that? You said you want Maryland is a leader on this issue, and
Right.
I think you're absolutely right. It is that Maryland stands as a good role model, at least in most respects. So, what exactly do we have in Maryland? What do we have nationally? What needs to be improved nationally?
So nationally, in 1994, the Brady Bill was passed, and that established background checks with the exception of private sales. And so initially, this loophole was started so that if I lived on a property and I wanted to give a gun to my son, I didn't have to go through a background check system, I could just give it to him and have it transferred, which is fine, except that as time has gone on, that small loophole has become much larger. For a while, gun shows were the worst of it. You could go to a gun show, and as long as it wasn't a federally licensed dealer, there would be people who would walk around with signs saying they're private dealers, they could sell you a gun, and background check was not necessary, and that's perfectly legal. And now, as the internet has grown, so have facilitated sales on the internet. And when you can't buy a gun directly on the internet, there are websites like Arms List, which is basically a Craigslist for firearms. And that would count as a private sale. So you could say, meet me in the Target parking lot somewhere in Virginia, and you could transfer that, and it's perfectly legal. And the problem is that even where in Maryland we have closed that gap for handguns in 1996, and then of course now we made it even tighter by not only do you need a background check, but you also need to have this handgun qualifying license. Right. But because that loophole exists on the national level, then it's really a patchwork of loose laws all over the country. And so about 44% of the guns used in crime in Maryland come from those states with looser laws. So they come from Pennsylvania, and they come from Virginia, and they come from Tennessee and Georgia. And without a national or federal law that's going to close that loophole, Maryland is still in danger. And so even though we have strengthened it here in Annapolis, we're still in danger because of these looser laws in other states.
And the reality that our borders are porous. These guns can come through, and it's 40% in Maryland, and it's what, 62%. And Baltimore, those guns are, illegally trafficked.
And how does Maryland, you mentioned previously that the requirements you have to go through in order to purchase a handgun in Maryland. You have to have, there has to be a formal license that's obtained. You've got to have a fingerprinting regimen. You have to complete a gun safety course, and obviously the criminal background check. How does Maryland compare to, say, those neighboring states which you just mentioned?
So we definitely have some of the strongest laws, not only in this region, right, but also in the country.
Okay. Absolutely. Yeah. Right. Well, we're going to take a break now, but when we return, I'll be exploring with Elizabeth and Jen an issue which they briefly commented on, but which has got compelling importance to our country, and that is the relationship between gun ownership and suicides. I'm talking today with Elizabeth Bannock, Executive Director of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, and Jen Poliakonis, who is the president of that organization. Suicide prevention is often left out of the conversation about gun violence and gun violence prevention. Why is it so important?
I think it's 2/3 of the problem, first of all.
Okay.
And I think what's really distressing to me is so often people will say, well, these people will kill themselves anyway. And I think research shows that that's not true. The reality is that guns are a very final method of doing this, and unlike pills or other methods of committing suicide, you rarely have a second chance. And what studies have shown is that those people who survived suicide attempts rarely attempt a second time. You don't have that choice when you use a gun. So it's not only an issue when we talk about just the people we love and our family members, but this is a public health issue. Suicide is a preventable, this is a disease that we're talking about. We need to relate to this as something that can be prevented and that we are able to prevent. And the reality is that regulations help in the prevention of this. You know, if a gun is locked up, because again, a lot of times we're talking about impulsive teenagers. If they don't have access to that, if the gun is locked up, it's not going to happen. So I think it's a crucial and, as you said, often missing part of this conversation.
Yeah. I read an article, I'm trying to remember where exactly the article appeared. It may have been in Mother Jones magazine, but I'm not sure, in which it described the efforts of an individual who, he actually owned a gun store, and he started to promote or screen people individually in terms of if someone looked like they were emotionally disturbed or there was some issue in which he had some concern about whether they might commit violence against themselves, he wouldn't sell them a gun. But unfortunately, he didn't get a lot of support from other gun shop owners on that.
And I think it's just so hard to tell. I mean, it's so hard to know who was suffering from depression. It's so hard to know who was having suicidal thoughts because people put on a strong face. I mean, I can, vividly remember being in high school and, like so many teenagers, suffering from depression myself. And my parents owned a handgun, and they kept it in their nightstand, loaded. It wasn't locked, and I vividly remember going in there multiple times and looking at that gun and deciding what I was going to do. Obviously, I never went through with that, but I knew that that was an option for me. And if there are parents out there who have teenage children who may be impulsive or who may be going through something, it's part of their responsibility as parents in keeping their kids safe to make sure that if they do own a handgun for protection, that it's unloaded and that it's locked and that that ammunition is stored separately.
And there are two additional points I want to make, and one is that as noble as that attempt is of that individual to sort of try to determine whether or not people are suicidal, it's really impossible because it is often so impulsive, and the person themselves who is committing the act sometimes doesn't know until 5 minutes before. And being sad isn't necessary, or isn't necessarily like a sign that someone's going to commit suicide, right? So you really need a mental health professional. And the second is that the issue of mental health is often brought up in this conversation, but it's often brought up as sort of a red herring. The reality is people who suffer from mental illness are more likely to be the victims of violence than they are to be the perpetrators. When we're talking about mass shootings and things like that, those are a very, very small percentage of the problem. And I want, for everyone to keep that in mind, that the issue of mental illness is really, really important when you're talking about suicide. But when you're talking about these mass shootings and things, it's a very small percentage.
Mm-hmm. And then you enter the whole issue of domestic violence, in which you've got a spouse or you have a child who engages in violence. If the gun is easily obtainable, if it's not locked up, if the ammunition is easily obtained, if it's not kept separately, if you're constantly locked and loaded, and it's in a place where anyone can touch it, you have all kinds of potential problems. And sometimes it occurs even through accident. One gets weary of reading the articles about small children who will get a hold of a weapon and do damage with it. I heard a story just the other day about a child who took a small child, 3 or 4 years old, who took a gun out and ended up shooting himself with it, serious injury. And of course, you hear other tales about children who actually shoot someone else. So, can you elaborate on what can be done about that in terms of educating the public that if you have one of these weapons, just keep them in a place where children can't get at them?
Well, I think the first thing is that the burden needs to be placed on the adult, the responsible individual. That there have been programs that have been developed by the gun lobby that put the burden on the child. The child needs to learn to stay away from guns. A child is not able to make these decisions. And even if you think your child is responsible enough, they're curious by nature. It only makes sense that they're going to explore. The first issue is the ammunition needs to be stored separately and locked separately from the locked gun. These are dangerous weapons, and yes, it's a right and privilege for individuals to own this, but with rights and privileges come responsibilities, and the top of the responsibility is making sure that that weapon is stored properly and away from individuals who could access them.
And actually, Maryland is a leader on this issue as well in terms of child access prevention. Our Annapolis legislature, passed a law back in 2000 in terms of internal trigger locks in handguns. And if you are an adult and your child gains access to that firearm, then you will be charged for negligence. And according to a study by Center for American Progress, Maryland is one of the lowest states in the nation for unintentional child shootings. And that's huge because it's showing that that law is working. And in states where they don't have that law, like Tennessee, they have the highest rates of unintentional child shootings, and they have no child access prevention laws either. So sometimes it's about education, but it also has to be combined with a consequence for negligent gun owners as well.
What do you actually focus the greatest amount of your attention on? I mean, obviously, Maryland's law, as you said, it's a model to the nation. But one could also make a statement that there's additional improvements and there are additional things that can be done. So I guess my question would be, are there additional opportunities that you see legislatively where the law could be strengthened even further? And are there educational opportunities within the state to educate people about how to safely store weapons if you choose to have them in your home? In short, both on the legislative side as well as on the education and awareness raising side, in a state that has probably one of the best records on this issue in the country in terms of what's been done. Where do you see your work being focused, and where do you think the best opportunity is in terms of the spending of your time?
I think one really important thing we have to do right now is I think we live in a state that, yes, has great laws, and I think we also live in a state with a lot of consensus among people that this is an important issue, that a lot of people in Maryland believe this is important. I think where we have a problem is that though people may believe this, sometimes they don't lend their voice to it. For instance, the other night we attend these handgun permit review board meetings. These are review board meetings when people have been denied a concealed carry permit. They go to appeal this to this board. So Jen and I have a program where we have people from our organization go to watch what happens in these meetings, watch whose appeal is overturned, whose is sustained. I went on Tuesday night. There were 11 pro-gun individuals there associated with a pro-gun organization. I was the only person on my side of the issue. This is often what happens when we go to Annapolis for our legislative session as well, that these rooms are packed with pro-gun individuals and that there are a handful of us on this issue. And I know that that's not illustrative of what Maryland stands for or what most people in Maryland believe, but if that's what it's going to look like in the State House on those days, that's what our legislators are going to see. What we need is more people getting out, being vocal that this is important, and really staying, I care about gun violence prevention. I'm going to show up on the lobby days in Annapolis. I'm going to go to the Handgun Permit Review Board. I'm going to show people that I care about this issue. And I think that's a very pressing need for us and what our work is doing and what we're doing right now in Maryland.
Absolutely.
And do you see this as your greatest challenge? Just motivating those people in the public who are a majority, if you look at the polls, every single poll that you see on issues of gun violence and handgun abuse, or issues such as criminal background checks, on issues such as the availability of automatic weapons. I mean, the polls are consistent. You've got a majority of the public that agrees with that. Unfortunately, it's a majority that's a mile long and an inch thick.
Right.
And it's people don't act on the issue. They don't vote necessarily on the issue. And on the other side, you've got a minority, but a minority that feels very, very strongly about the issue and is not especially open to compromise.
Well, I think even more than people who support gun violence prevention laws and legislation and measures who don't raise their voices, I think also it's that the NRA and the gun lobbies, especially on the national level, hold a lot of sway with our leaders. And so while they know that 91% of the American public supports universal background checks, they're still voting for the lobby who will help pay for their campaigns, who will donate money to them. That's one of our big problems. And the other thing is that I think one of the hardest things isn't just that they're voting where their pocket is, but I think that they have done a really great job selling a narrative that this is a controversial issue. It's something that the NRA sells. It's something that leaders who support the NRA sell, and this is absolutely a myth. As I just said, 90% of the American public supports universal background checks. A majority of the public supports an assault weapons ban. A majority of Maryland supporters supported handgun purchaser licensing. That's not controversial. And I even was, speaking to a friend of the family down in Florida, and he heard that I, work in gun violence prevention. And the very first thing before he even said hello was, he slapped down his Florida wear and carry permit on the table. And I said, well, that's great. If you want to have that, that's okay. It's as long as you went through the correct procedure and you got your background check. But when we actually sat down and we talked about each individual issue, we agreed on almost everything. And I think that that's the majority of the American public. So this idea that this is controversial, that this is partisan with voters, is just not true. It's only that way in Congress. And I think once the American public take their voice and those needs to the voting booth, on election day, to get people who actually prioritize this issue, I think that that's when we're going to be able to see progress on this issue nationally.
How do you think that the results of the recent election will impact the conversation nationally about reducing gun violence?
Listen, I'll be quite honest, we were heartbroken by the results, and it doesn't bode well for our cause. I think it does speak to the issue of complacency, which we've been talking about, and the need for individuals to get out, to vote, to speak. But we now have a president who's beholden to the NRA, and that's really concerning. But I hold a great deal of hope that there are going to be a lot of people that were as devastated by this election result as I was, and that they will raise their voices and work even harder now to make sure that things change, and that we make this a priority, making our children, our families, our communities safe again.
Okay. I am certain that many of our viewers will want to learn more about your organization. How can they get in touch with you? Do you have a phone number? Do you have a website that you can direct them to?
So you can go to our website, which is www.mdpgv.org, and you can join. You can send an email, and you can even send an email to Liz at mdpgv.org or Jen at mdpgv.org. And we can add you to our mailing list. We can answer any questions that you have. And we are always open, not only to have people receive our emails, but people who really want to be an active participant in this fight.
Yeah, as we said, people who are willing to come up to Annapolis with us, things like that we need.
Yeah, or just make a phone call. Sometimes it doesn't need to be driving down to Annapolis. It's, calling those legislators and making sure that they know we are in this for the long haul.
Thank you for viewing our program today, and please join us again on Annapolis Mosaics. If you would like to have more information about the Annapolis Human Relations Commission, jot down the information on your screen. You can reach us at 263-7998 or by email at hrcommission@annapolis.gov. Or check out our page at the City of Annapolis website. Go to www.annapolis.gov, click on City Government, then Boards and Commissions, and scroll down to the Human Relations Commission page. And always remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We have flown the air like birds and swum the seas like fishes, but have yet to learn the simple act of walking the earth as brothers and sisters."